Welcome, everyone, to Ladder Daily Digest. We honor creators, and we have on someone that I've wanted from the very beginning, but I didn't want her to come on when I only had 3 subscribers. Natasha Helfer, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
And thanks, Megan and Randy, for hopping on with me.
Good to be here.
This is exciting for me because I think I mentioned Natasha was the very first podcast I watched as my shelf was breaking was John DeLynn at Natasha's excommunication. Everyone was waiting outside the building. They wouldn't let people in, and John DeLynn was covering it live, and I that's what really started my deconstruction train. And then Natasha was the first person to accept my friend request.
Aww.
As I started into the Mormon community on Facebook. So yeah, this is really special to me. Plus, I've gotten to watch you on several podcasts and really admire what you do. And Megan is one of my favorite people in the whole world. And I even love Jean. So I'm like with 3 of my favorite people here.
I didn't know that we had such a similar trajectory, because I will tell you that it was during Natasha's excommunication. Natasha, thank you so much for all the work that you've done. My daughter actually told me about you. She was following you on Instagram, and she said, "Mom, have you heard of this Mormon sex therapist?" And I said, "No, is that a thing?" And I was so excited because I was like, yes, finally, there is somebody out there in the world who identifies as Mormon, who is also teaching truthful information about healthy sexual practices. And I had said for so many years, in dealing with my own sexual abuse, I could not find a therapist who could even validate my experience, or who could even really turn me on to the idea that it wasn't my fault, and that, there was more that I could do than just pray harder to overcome these horrible feelings I was having. And so I found a lot of hope and excitement when I finally found you on Instagram. And then it was just shortly before your excommunication. So I, like Randy, followed that story. And the very first time that I ever saw John DeLynn or knew who he was, when he was leading the vigil for your excommunication. And I was like, who is this guy? He seems like he knows a lot of people. And, there are all these people here to support you, Natasha. And your story was both heartbreaking and validating for me, because it was so similar to some of the experiences that I had with male leadership in the church. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to share with us today.
Thank you. I guess sorry that was your first exposure to me, because that was quite a doozy of an experience. When you say, Megan, that you had a hard time with therapists validating your trauma, are you talking specifically about LDS therapists or therapists in general?
Yeah, so I was the victim of child sex trafficking from the ages of 7 to 11, and around the age of 13 or so, after I was out of that situation, is when I started to have some really negative mental health consequences from that, not to mention my family of origin not being the healthiest in the world. And so I really wanted to go to therapy. At the time, my parents would not let me, because they were so, I think, ashamed that they had a child who needed therapy or wanted therapy. So I didn't really get into therapy until I ended up pregnant at the age of 19. My dad said the first thing my dad said to me was, "Well, if I knew you were going to have sex, I would have told you to use a condom." And I was like,
"Oh gosh,
Dad, I know what condoms are." So my mom, told me to go to my bishop, and my bishop referred me to LDS Social Services, where the therapist that I went to essentially tried to convince me to give the child up for adoption, or to marry the super abusive guy that I was with. Neither one of those things were going to happen. I chose to keep her. And, I was like, I'm just going to raise her. Whatever happens, happens. I'm not giving my child away. So that was my first exposure to quote unquote therapy, because she really was, not only was she telling my mom things that I told her confidentially in therapy, but she was also just encouraging me to pray harder, to be more faithful, to read my scriptures every day. and basically was ignoring the fact that the reason I got into that situation was because of the programming I received as a child, where I wasn't allowed to say no to anything. And then the second therapy situation I was in was marriage counseling. And it was another LDS social services therapist who basically told me things like, well, you really shouldn't be working outside the home, so I don't know why you're stressed about this, when my husband was chronically underemployed and not able to provide for the family. So just some harmful ideology that continued to get woven through what should have been healing.
Wow. Well, if you want to hear some of my motivation of some of the things that I've done in my life, which I think is a bit of what your show's about, it's stories like Megan's that got me very motivated, especially with the unethical underpinnings of counselors and therapists who are religiously biased to the point that they cannot follow their own ethical codes. So,
That's right. We'll have more to this discussion in a little bit, but I also want to say that in the description to the show, I'll include the Natasha Helfer excommunication fiasco is what I'll call it. And also I'll refer to a longer interview that Natasha had with John DeLynn, where she explains a lot more about her life. But for now, we'll have Natasha give maybe a 5-minute Mormon upbringing and how she got to become a therapist.
Okay, I can try my 5-minute version. Let's see. So my Mormon story begins really prior to my birth, when my parents, my mother's from Argentina originally, and my father is from New York. Neither one of them were LDS or had any type of LDS background. They get together through their own kind of interesting creative journey, and they kind of decide that they're going to go west in the United States, and they don't have a lot of money, and their goal is to make it to California, and they run out of pretty much resources in Idaho, and they figure out how to get enrolled at Idaho State University so they can start getting their education, and voila, they meet a lot of Mormons. And so and just for the sake of this interview, I will say that, I use LDS and Mormon interchangeably. I know that there's some language ideas about that these days, but to me, the Latter-day Saints are a specific mainstream portion of the Mormon community. And so I just see Mormon as more inclusive of the whole kit and caboodle. So anyway, so they get their first, I guess, exposure to Mormon folks, Mormon ideology, Mormon friends, but they don't join the church at that point. It was many years later when a series of events led my parents to being overseas through the military, and then my father wanted to go to medical school. Knowing Spanish, he just kind of enrolled in a program in the country of Spain, because the educational system there was quite different. It's almost, the way I understand it, was pretty much almost anybody can get into medical school. Hardly anybody makes it out of medical school, which is different than our United States system, where it's very difficult to get into medical school. But once you're in, you're more than likely going to be able to finish. So he did that. And so my first memories are living in Spain. I was born in Germany, but I remember living in Spain. And I remember probably being about 5 years old when these two missionaries came and knocked on our door. It was a pretty lonely time for my parents. Franco was still kind of in charge, who was a dictator of Spain at the time. The church was very new in Spain. They had not been allowed to proselyte for many years. So probably in the last decades, from the time I'm talking about, was when the church was starting to have missionaries on the ground. And so there were really no missionaries. Well, no, there was no chapel or church in the industrialized city we happened to be in, which was Valladolid. And because my parents were, my dad was American, my mom from Argentina, they're supposedly in medical school. I think people thought he was secret FBI or something. So they just didn't really socialize with my parents very much, because they were kind of foreigners. And back then there was still a lot of suspicion about things like that. So when these two Mormon guys come to the door and they're American, they speak English, my dad speaks English and all that. So they just kind of got a friendship going. And my parents were like, you guys are welcome anytime, but we're not interested in learning anything about the church. And but of course, a few weeks or months, I don't know how much later, they leave the Book of Mormon. My mother gets all, I remember all these things. These are like actually vivid memories. My mother's like, I knew they were going to try to convert us. See, they're leaving the Book of Mormon in our house on purpose. And my dad was always like, give them a break, whatever. So eventually, my parents joined the church, and I am just a little kiddo in this very, very small, tiny branch. I think we were the first members to join in Valladolid. I remember the first church meetings being held in our tiny little apartment. Then we graduated to this little storefront, like a butcher shop that was closed on Sundays, so we could rent it and we could use that space on Sundays. And they were just starting to build the first chapel when we were starting to move away. So I never got to see that. So that was my very first introduction to Latter-day Saint land. And it was quite lovely as far as my memories are of that, very communal oriented, meeting new people and friends that we hadn't really had before. I remember quite a few of my initial friendships of kids kind of in the primary program. And I got a lot of opportunities as a 5-year-old or 6-year-old or 7-year-old to do things like speak because nobody could, there weren't enough people. So I'd go up there with my, ideas about God or whatever and start having my first sacrament meeting speeches. So then we moved back to the States, which is where I got baptized at the age of 8. And my family, I think, my parents, I would say, took the church seriously, probably more in the sense of the spirit of the law, no, not so much the letter of the law type of approach to Mormonism. And over time, my mother became quite disillusioned once she started learning the polygamy history, which of course had never been mentioned once during the missionary discussions. And I became I was the oldest of 4, and I became the one who was probably the most devoted out of the entire family. And so when I would see my parents slacking, I would feel like I needed to, up the ante. So I would be the one doing family home evening, and making sure we were getting there on Sunday. My dad being a physician, sometimes he would work on Sunday, and my mom wouldn't probably go on those days. And so I'd gather all my siblings and we'd show up, at Sunday without any parents sometimes. So our parents were kind of like, whatever, you can do whatever you want, but they didn't take it horribly seriously. And so I didn't grow up, I think, with a lot of the orthodoxy or the strictness or rigidness in my home in particular. My mother being from Argentina, and I think the times also kind of being in the 80s and 90s, I definitely feel like I grew up with a lot of purity culture that wasn't just Mormon. It was, her remnants of Catholicism and traditional kind of Hispanic family values. And so there was a medley of, I think, cultural forces that were starting to impact, how I felt about my own body, about my own privacy, about my own sexuality. And off I went into, emerging adulthood land.
Did you have, Natasha, did you have the licked cupcake lesson or anything like that?
Yeah, so I actually had several of the lessons, not the licked cupcake one. I had the chewing gum one. I had the nail in the board one, where you take out the nail, but there's still a hole that remains. There was one healthier one, which was like a water that could turn red with dye, but then they put in something else and it would clear it all together again. So it was kind of
Bleach.
so it wasn't like there was any residue per se, but so maybe that was a healthier object lesson. I'm not sure.
That's the one that I taught when I was in Young Women's with the food. We'd put the food coloring in and lots of different colors of food coloring, and it would turn all brown. And then you pour in this water that has bleach in it. But the kids don't know it has bleach in it. You just say, this is the holy water.
Right. The atonement water.
Right.
Natasha, I am on cloud 9 right now because I, as a missionary, served in Valladolid for 6 months of my mission.
Oh, wow.
And it was my favorite all-time place in my mission. And we had that little storefront chapel that you're talking about. That's
Oh,
where we went. That's all we had. And I'm wondering what year you were there, because
where were you there?
I used that little demonstration with the food coloring and bleach. What year was that you were in Spain?
What years were you on your mission? Let me see if I can.
From 78 to 80.
Yeah. Yeah. My brother was born in 78. I'm guessing we were there at the same time, and we probably left around
Wow.
9.
Oh my gosh.
That
We
is,
could be in that same little branch. Yeah.
there was
Because
no other branch.
what's that?
There was no other branch. I'm sure we were in the only
Oh,
branch together.
that's what I'm saying. Yeah,
Yeah.
we only had and we had that little storefront, but I'll tell you that the youth were so strong in that little branch, and they would always hang out at the chapel, and I just loved that town. Valladolid will always be strong in my heart.
Wow. That's
So
amazing.
that's amazing that you and I may have been in the same branch at the same time.
I'm guessing we were. So I have
That's amazing.
I have very strong recollections of the first 2 missionaries, Elder Hunt and Elder Jensen. After that, I remember lots of pictures with missionaries and stuff, but I don't necessarily have recollection of all the other missionaries that came through. So, but I'm guessing you were one of them. That's amazing.
Yeah, Elder Jensen. I know Elder Jensen.
Well, that's the guy who baptized one of my parents.
Oh my gosh! Did they use the portable baptismal font where you had to
No,
set it up,
my parents,
or
they
did we go to the river?
no, we went all the way to Madrid.
Oh, you went to Madrid.
Yeah, and they got
Gotcha.
baptized in a small chapel that was set up already there. Mm-hmm.
Well, we had 3 choices. It was either travel to Madrid or set up a little portable font that was made out of tarp, or go to the river. So we usually went to the river
Okay.
to do our baptisms.
Okay.
But how richly bizarre. That just tickles the heck out of me that you were in Valladolid, because most people haven't even heard of that
Yeah.
place. So.
Yeah.
Well, it's official. Randy is connected to everyone.
Oh my gosh.
Oh man. Well, and going back to the object lesson, the one that I always have to point out because it just makes me have a tickly moment of funniness, but is the brownie object lesson, which is not as well known.
I know that one.
Anyway, so I think it was a fast Sunday, and this young women's leader brings in this wonderful tray of brownies, right? Which of course the whole smell, and we're all like, woohoo, we got treats on fast Sunday. We can have something yummy. And she starts off by saying, well, I just want you all to know that I did put in a tablespoon of my baby's poop into this brownie batter. So do you really want the brownies now? And the whole sexual object lesson kind of went over my head because I was like, what's wrong with me that I still want these brownies? So then I was thinking, do I have an eating disorder?
It's only a little bit of poop, just a little bit.
I was like, I'm sure it baked out, right? Like, I'm sure if it heated up enough.
So when I got that lesson, it wasn't about sexual shame. It was about rated R movies. It was like, don't watch a rated R movie because it's only a little bit bad. There's probably only one scene. There's maybe a little bit of language. It's like, there's just a little bit of poop in the brownies. And then I actually used that analogy when I was leaving the church with one of my daughters. We were having a very intense conversation about this because she had been very devout, and she was one of those kids she was 100% seminary attender. She would have gone on a mission, I'm sure, gotten married in the temple. And, she just gradually had kind of drifted away. And so we were having a conversation about that. And she was like, she said, there are so many things about the church that I think are good and that I love. But then there are these other things that I just don't understand. And the November 15th policy was one, and that was one that was really hard for me. And then also she said, she named purity culture and sexual shame. And she said, I just think the way that they teach about modesty and sexuality is so harmful. And I said, I agree with you. And I was in the same position. I just hadn't gone back to church after the pandemic. And I just said, I previously really loved the church. I was very devout. I was a temple attender and all of that. And I just very tearfully said to her, it was such a difficult moment for me to think that something that I originally thought was so sweet and so delicious and so good had just a little bit of poop in it. And I said, now that I know there's poop in the brownies, am I going to keep eating them? No. Am I going to keep feeding them to my kids? No. I'm going to separate out all the ingredients and I'm going to keep the things that I think are good. And then I'm going to rebuild my own brownies without the poop in them.
So are you guys saying that you're not supposed to put poop in brownies? Because I make incredible brownies and I've always added just about a half a cup.
Just a bit.
But what's missing from that is that we're all full of shit, really. I mean, as humans, both literally and, everybody has like their own version of a story to tell. And the church leaders are humans, we'll just say.
Well, and people like nuts in their brownies, so I actually dip my nuts in there too. So now I'm learning all kinds of things now.
Yeah. So back to Natasha's story.
Yes, right.
What things happened that made you decide to get into the mental health care field?
Yeah, I that was kind of it's interesting to go back and think how probably uncareful I was about choosing my path. I was just kind of like la-di-da, what's next? It wasn't like I'd had this idea that I would be a therapist from early age or anything. I did go into my adolescence and my early adulthood with some sexual improprieties, according to being LDS, which at the time, of course, I had so much guilt and shame about. I had premarital sex with a high school boyfriend and then went through the whole repentance process and then went to BYU and started with a business degree. Absolutely hated every second of that. So quickly decided I needed to change something. And at the time, I don't know why several of my friends had just kind of told me I was a good listener and that I was a good friend. And my parents, I think, had complained quite a few times while I was going through high school that I was probably spending too much time with friends' problems. I think they were actually trying to have me have healthy boundaries. like it's not your job to, solve all your friends' problems. And so something about all of that messaging had me think, well, I kind of like sitting with people's problems. Why don't I get paid for it? Right. And so that was my thoughts of starting into psychology. And, but even then, as I was getting my bachelor's degree in psychology at BYU, you start getting a little bit of sexual education, not very much. But one thing that I was very much starting to pick up on in the literature at the time was that people who had been sexually abused, one of the potential effects of that was promiscuity. And that word, which is a very now kind of like moral objectifiable word, like who gets to decide what is promiscuous, was still being used on the regular, not so much today. But and I had also had some childhood sexual abuse. And so now it was interesting to see when I'm looking back now, I would have not ever put this together back then, but I was making sense of my world through different cultural snapshots of how sexuality was explained to me. And so since the LDS church did not want me to be having sex at all, and the mental health world was saying people who are sexually abused are promiscuous, you can imagine how I started identifying myself as a promiscuous woman who did not have really great control over her sexuality. And again, I think I had two sexual partners prior to getting married. So I don't know where that lands on the scale of promiscuity. But I did. I loved making out. I was very heterosexual. I loved male attention and I loved feeling attractive and sexy and desirous and all of that instead of seeing that as kind of one of the many ways we can normally develop as human beings, I saw it through this lens of there's something wrong with me, right? I don't know how to be by myself. I am too dependent on men and sexuality. I'm promiscuous. I'm out of control. And those kinds of messages, it took me decades to unpack, even with mental health knowledge and becoming a sex therapist and everything over time, really
And
did.
Natasha, I hate to interrupt. I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
I just have to say this, that how often do you hear about the men or the boys being promiscuous in the church? It's
No,
never the males. It's always the females. They're the ones that are causing the issues. And that's just always been a real nail in my shoe, that it's never the male's fault. In high school, I grew up in a little town in Gilbert, Arizona. It was just a cow town at the time. And every now and then a girl would, disappear for 9 months. And they would always say, she got pregnant. And oh dear, you never hear about the guy that got her pregnant. You never hear about the men being promiscuous. So yeah, that really bugs me. And
yeah,
so, and
I would say that there are just different gendered ways that we shame both men and women. I think men, you're absolutely right that the term promiscuous is more usually used to describe women versus men, and that's culturally true kind of everywhere. Where men get shamed, especially in more high demand religions like ours, because there are a lot of religions that are kind of double standard and really only gatekeep female sexuality. But in our faith community, we do gatekeep all sexuality, whether you're male or female. But men are not necessarily told that it is their job to guard for sexual purity within themselves. It's more about, you are a sexual being, oh penis owner, so make sure you keep it in your pants. And if you don't know how to keep it in your pants, we're going to go down the sex addiction type of narrative and make it kind of like a clinical judgment of why you are unable to control your sexuality. Whereas women are typically getting a story about, it is somewhat your job to make sure you're not attracting male attention, which is, we'll get into purity rhetoric, but one of the big ones is modesty rhetoric, right? Control how you present your body, because otherwise, I guess these penis owners don't have brains where they can control themselves, is kind of how we treat everybody, which is disrespectful to everyone. So it doesn't help anyone. But this ownership of the responsibility lands in the female kind of psyche. And then if her main job is to protect herself from the male sexual drive. Now, if she has sexual drive herself and goes out there and does something, that seems so foreign to the purity narrative psyche that now she's a slut. She must be a whore, right? All these language things that you have for women: sluts, whores, concubines, promiscuous, nymphomaniacs. None of those terms exist in the male.
Is there a male version of Jezebel in the Bible? And also, has there any males ever get stoned for adultery? I only know that the women do.
Yeah.
The only term that I ever heard to refer negatively to a man who perhaps had too many partners was dog. I got warned as a teenager, oh, he's a dog. And that just means he's going to go around and be with whoever he wants to. But that's the only term I ever heard.
Yeah. A lot of the terms for men are kind of more this like middle thing that is also kind of like cool. So like the Don Juan or the stud, so even if there's like a negative component to it, like even a dog, that's been reclaimed by a lot of men, especially I would say in Black rap artist community, where it's like, that's right, I'm a dog, right? And so it's interesting to see how these terms have been used to monitor people's behaviors, primarily women, And I do think a lot of it does have to do with reproduction, because women are the ones who bear the children, who then, historically speaking, prior to having DNA testing, how could you control whether or not that's your baby? Which in most indigenous cultures doesn't even matter. But why does it matter in our capitalistic kind of industrialized cultures is inheritances and monies. And I don't want my monies that I've worked on going to somebody else's baby that isn't mine. So you can start seeing property and territory and all of those things start having a pretty big impact on human sexuality in many cultures early on.
Yeah.
That diverged from my story, so I apologize.
No, it's a good diversion, because it kind of does take us into the area of, language that needs to change with regard to how we talk about sex and sexuality, whether within or without a religious culture. And the thing that has bothered me so much is what Randy had brought up beforehand, is this meaning of consent and the idea that we don't really understand it. Obviously, we have so many examples in media right now where it's very obvious that people don't understand consent. So I would love to have more of a conversation about that if you're willing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, consent is obviously the first principle and kind of a sexual health model is consent. And the second one is non-coercion, which is somewhat related to consent, because coercion talks about power dynamics where, you may think that you're having consent, but if you're not looking at the power dynamics, it may be very clear that consent isn't genuine. So when we think about this from a purity culture model, really, we grew up with more of what I call an ownership model. We did not really grow up with this idea that our bodies and our sexuality belong to us personally. We grew up with the ideas that our bodies and our sexuality belong first and foremost to God, and then of course to our parents, and then of course to the church, and even to this kind of potential future spouse that we were all supposed to be aspiring to, right? So right off the bat, if your body belongs to God, one of the things I like to point out is that we're, in essence, psychologically trained or even groomed to have 24/7 a powerful male figure have access to, visually having access to us, psychologically having access to us, auditorily having access to us, because of course that's how we pray. And he knows us through and through. So you're growing up with the idea that anything sexual, which is inherently fairly private for most people, even naturally speaking, people trend to, over developmental stages, become more private with their sexuality. There is no privacy between you and God. God, in essence, is an ongoing 24/7 voyeur. That's who we grow up with. And
if all that stuff is in the book of life, that's probably the biggest pornography book ever.
well, and I remember this having impact on me, even when I was like, I remember having a prayer in the bathroom in middle school, asking God to just please not watch me while I'm going to the bathroom. Right? That was in my psyche. And then the devil, who's also a very powerful male figure in Christianity, has also enough knowledge about you that he knows how to tempt you. So you've got these two very powerful male figures who have access to your brain, to your fantasies. One of them is trying to supposedly help you and keep you clean and virtuous and pure. And one of them is really trying to get you to do naughty things. So your entire sexual development story as a Christian and a Mormon is kind of based on your drives, understanding your natural drives and interests and preferences through this lens of, kind of the angel and the devil on both of your shoulders. And what kind of psychological assault do you think that creates for people as they're trying to figure out their own identities, right? So that to me is very difficult. There's no consent in that. There's zero consent. There's no, hey, I'm okay with you watching me 24/7 or anything like that. This is just the way it is. And right off the bat, it creates a vulnerability to then feel like, well, then other people in authority should also have access to my sexuality. So parents have access to my journals, or to dragging, finding me masturbating and then dragging me into the bishop's office. And we all act like this is the right of other people to manage and monitor, especially minor sexuality, with hardly any privacy or self-authority given. And so you get to emerging adulthood and you have not practiced consent or boundaries or understanding of where I begin or where I end at all. And then on top of it, if you've had any type of premarital experiences, which this happened to me twice, both with somebody who I was engaged to, and I think it really ended up ruining our engagement, and also my ex-husband who, we talk about this very differently now, but at the time, both of those men felt very entitled to their anger and disappointment at my inability to have stayed truthful and faithful to them before I even met them, which had a huge impact on then our coupled and even marital sexuality. Because you can imagine two people coming together, and I see this all the time as a therapist, is these two people who come together, and whether it's you had sex with somebody else or sexuality that I don't think you should have had, because usually when we talk about sex, we're talking about intercourse, which is a whole nother thing I don't agree with. But the other, or we had some type of sexual mishap or misstep. And now that we feel so bad about that, even if we're the only ones we've ever had any type of main sexual encounter with, we now get married, but under this cloud of shame, especially if maybe we didn't confess and went to the temple anyway, or we did confess, but then we had to have our temple ceremony delayed and our whole marriage was delayed. Like, these are very common stories, which also then they don't remain private. How are you going to explain to your whole faith community that you have to delay your wedding date for 2 or 3 months when everybody's already got their tickets and there's venues planned? So now it becomes a community story. This is not a privacy sexual story, which is also what oftentimes happens even in our rituals. Like, if you go in and confess to the bishop that you've been masturbating or that you've been petting or whatever those things are, especially as a teenager, what's the number one thing that happens is, especially if you're a male, you get your right to pass the sacrament revoked. Or if you're a female or a male, you can't take the sacrament. Well, this is a public ceremony. This is something that happens within the public eye of the community. And I can guarantee you that I don't think subconsciously most people are thinking, Jimmy didn't take the sacrament. I wonder if he cheated on his ACTs. I think what they're thinking is, Jimmy must be having an issue with masturbation or pornography, or maybe him and Jenny, who are dating, went a little too far. And so you don't have to publicly shame people. Well, we do publicly shame people. I mean, like verbally, like actually say, which we actually have history of that as well in the Mormon church, that they, if you had a sexual sin, it would be publicly expressed to the entire congregation. So I'm not exactly sure the time frame of when we stopped doing that, but now it's this kind of more subtle, passive aggressive way that we basically still let everybody know, hey, so and so is on the naughty list. And of course, this is very complicated. I'm going all over the place, but you just got to deal with my brain today. Very complicated when higher ups, what I have noticed be a very big pattern in my sitting with the thousands of people I've sat with throughout my 30-year career, is that we're pretty hard on younger people. You can't go on your mission if you've been masturbating. You can't go on your mission now if you've had premarital sex, even though you want to repent. But people who are in situations where they have actually been perpetrators to minors, to teens, or domestic violence types of sexual crimes, those people who tend to be older and tend to already be in pretty big positions in the church, now all of a sudden there's this kind of hush hush vibe, and we're going to take care of it internally. We have a big issue of not including authorities in these kinds of high demand church activities. And Mormonism is one out of like 5 main religions that have been studied specifically for this purpose, that they make the list of kind of like not great dynamics in this arena. And so you get people who are actually doing criminal acts who have less official punishment than sometimes a young boy who his whole life trajectory gets redirected in our culture because he's not deemed worthy to go on a mission due to solo sex activities. It is mind blowing.
I totally agree with that. What always bothers me about is that it's not that they're disciplining every person who has solo activities. They're disciplining the people who are willing to come forward and talk about it, which means that they're actually the more honest of the people, because almost everyone does it, although that there is a percentage of people, and maybe you can speak to that, who consider themselves asexual. But for the most part, solo activities are a normative practice, which is something that I learned language about from you, because I didn't know how to really tell my kids that, except to say, what you do in the privacy of your bedroom is your business, and I'm not going to shame you for it, because I just felt like it was always so wrong. Yeah. And then the whole narrative of sexual addiction, which if you could speak to that clinically, I would really appreciate it.
Yeah, and it's difficult to speak to that clinically in like 5 minutes. So I will just say that I have done a myriad of podcasts on this topic on my own podcast, and I have brought in really kind of world-renowned experts, and both neuroscientists and sex therapists, to talk about this subject. The Mormon Mental Health Association, which I founded, we came out with a position statement that you can find on that website around the whole sex addiction narrative. And ASECT, the American Association for Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, which is how I became a certified sex therapist. They're the only body in the United States and even globally that kind of certifies sex therapists in this way, that has been agreed upon by a large body of folks who are in this field. They came out with a position statement about this as well. So the primary thing that we want to share with you as far as some basic education on this is that there was a gentleman called Patrick Carnes back in the 80s who was noticing a lot of people coming into his practice with what we would deem, especially if you think about sexual history and what has been deemed normative sexual behavior, has definitely changed. And in the 80s, we're kind of in the middle of the abstinence movement, and we're kind of we're starting to deal with the HIV epidemic, and we are kind of having a backsliding moment, which is what typically happens when you're making progress. It's never a one-way slide, right? It's like you make some progress, and then a bunch of people have a fit about that, and then we have to backslide for about a decade, and then hopefully we'll keep going. So that was also happening from the kind of the 70s sexual revolution. So people were very upset at the hippies and the flower children and the Woodstocks, and all the ideas that were fairly difficult for a lot of people with Christian and Puritan kind of backgrounds to handle that type of shift.
Like free expression of sex, free sex.
Right. So here comes Patrick Carnes, who also has his own biases. I'm pretty sure he comes from a religious background himself, and he starts seeing all these problems and starts correlating them with substance dependence, right? So when you have somebody who drinks alcohol or who ingests cocaine or methamphetamines or whatever it is over a certain period of time, this has been studied, and there's evidence-based research to show that we can become dependent to certain substances, including substances like caffeine that most of us ingest, or substances like sugar, which most of us ingest. So these substances interact with our inner chemistry and can become, for a certain segment of the population, quite problematic. Now, not everybody who drinks alcohol becomes an alcoholic, and not everybody who tries cocaine becomes addicted to cocaine. But we start seeing a lot of issues with substance dependence. We've seen them throughout the history of the world, and they're pretty similar no matter where you go in the world, as far as how they impact a human body. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish, if you're Mormon, if you're evangelical, if you're atheist, that substance does not know your religion. It's going to affect you because you are a human body. Okay, so let's fast forward then to sex addiction, which is this language that Patrick Carnes kind of just borrowed this model and said, well, there's some similarities here. You know, it seems like when people want to have sex, they can't stop wanting to have sex. I mean, we're talking about a natural body, you know, it's not anything that you're ingesting into yourself. In the 80s, you have to remember this was pre-internet as well. So we didn't have internet pornography, which is, you know, the thing that's now very readily available. It was harder to access pornography in the 80s. You know, you had to actually go buy a magazine or have HBO started existing. You had to pay for extra things, you know, so it wasn't as readily available. Granted, pornography has been around since the cave days. There's beautiful cave dwellings of penises erupting and vaginas opening. And, you know, so the human condition has always been very curious about sexuality. And we have always expressed sexuality in all the art forms, you know, literature, the Bible has sexuality in it, art, music, poetry, whatever means we have to express our human story, it's more than likely going to include a sexual component to that. So fast forward, he starts creating this kind of metaphor, creates this model of sex addiction, and it takes off. It takes off. And this is not evidence-based model. This is not where there's a lot of scientific rigor associated with this model. It's a one-man show. Which
probably thought about it while he was in the bathroom.
Yeah, maybe. And I never really, I always assume the best in people. I always think people are doing, you know, maybe are well-intentioned, but they're well-intentioned through their own worldview lens. And we know that if we want scientific rigor, and if we want, and even science has had this issue where people, you know, have their own ideas or their own biases, and it takes us a minute to recorrect. But at least in science, you have the scientific method, which allows you to challenge, to come up with better ways of doing things. So it's not that science hasn't totally messed up a lot of stuff, but it's corrected itself. Whereas in religious kinds of worldviews, there is no correcting of self or of the community, because of this kind of argument that God is the same, you know, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and things that were written in a very different context, you know, thousands of years ago, and even in different languages, somehow must still apply literally to how we feel about things today. And so it really lacks the ability to evolve and to grow and to bring in new information and new kind of values and even new morals that we've developed as a human body to the current take. So going back to consent, when you have folks being, you know, growing up in a culture where, like I said, you've got these voyeuristic, like supernatural powers that always have access to your body and mind. You have a community that feels very entitled to sexual information, whether it's your parents reading your journals or knowing, you know, taking doors off of your rooms, or, you know, teaching you a lot of what I would say are psychologically scary concepts about sexuality. Then you have your bishops who have every right to take you into a room by themselves in Mormon land and ask you very specific questions about what you're doing with your body, how you're using your body. And there is no role modeling of boundaries, like saying things like, well, Bishop, I don't think that's any of your business, or Bishop, I'm not comfortable answering that question. Anything that is boundaried is seen as rebellion, right? So you must not really be repentant if you're not willing to answer these questions. And even in the sex addiction model, this is seen as you are in denial, right? You are in denial. So if you're not wanting to answer these questions and give a complete, very detailed disclosure to both your therapist and usually your devastated wife, because we do this really only to men. This is one area where we really don't do the sex addiction to women as much. That's been shown to be the case in the research, that most of the people getting treated for sex addiction are both white, male, and usually of like middle to higher social economic class. So this is not taken over as much in the Hispanics or Black communities or Asian communities. So it's kind of an interesting kind of, again, white Christian type of modality and thought process of how we have explained male sexuality.
Is it sort of an oversimplification to say that, men who have an interest beyond traditional intercourse with a female get labeled as a sex addict if they have any sort of interest that's outside of that boundary? Is that oversimplifying it, or how would you say?
No, it's not oversimplifying at all. Anything that's outside of the tight-lipped box of what we might call heteronormative vanilla sexuality between a man and a woman has a lot of historic and current precedents to be considered sex addiction. So the other problem that was happening is that tons of gay men were being called sex addicts and encouraged to enter things like conversion therapy, right? Which is highly, highly correlated with religious communities and completely ineffective. And not just ineffective, because ineffective means you didn't turn straight, but actually harmful, like a trauma type of therapy that now you have to go to more therapy for to recover from this therapy that was so like not just ineffective, but actually harmful to your psyche and to your life. Anybody who's interested in kink, anybody who is interested in non-monogamy, anybody, so the wide variety of how the human diversity spectrum shows up in sexuality, if it doesn't fit this one box that we've decided as a Christian puritanical community is the right way to be, and we have God to back us up, which who can fight that, right? Nobody can trump anybody's idea of God. Science usually doesn't win over that. And now we are pathologizing a huge segment of the population and having a narrative that is very, very unhelpful. And I just want to be very clear, this is not just my opinion, like the sex addiction diagnosis officially does not exist. You will not find a code or a description of a diagnosis in either the DSM-5 or the ICD-11 that will say sex addiction. So for a long time, what was happening is that if you were going to therapy and they were diagnosing you with this, first of all, it's just a faux diagnosis, but they would find some other diagnosis to bill your insurance through, or you just would not be covered by insurance because of insurance is saying we're not going to cover services for a diagnosis that doesn't exist, right?
Now, so thank you for putting a nice, neat little bow on it, that it just doesn't exist in the DSM. Can you just to further clarify, is there any circumstance that you've seen clinically or studied where someone would qualify to something akin to an addiction, for example, that something that's harming their personal life or behavior that falls into that category somewhere?
Yeah, so we do know that all human behavior can go wonky. That's true of any human behavior, from eating to exercising, to scrapbooking, to sex, to sexual behavior. We as humans typically can either engage with our behaviors in what we might call healthy, balanced ways, or in ways that are extreme or exaggerated or feel even out of control to us. So Doug Braun-Harvey came up with the out of control treatment, out of control sexual behavior kind of moniker to try to get that away from sex addiction. I'm still not a huge fan of that because, again, in Christian communities, people will take that to mean almost anything that doesn't fit into that little box. So we still have the same issue. And the ICD-11 came out with obsessive, I'm not going to have it on the tip of my tongue, but something around like obsessive compulsive behavior around sexuality, which I always find interesting because obsessive compulsive behavior already exists. So why do we have to pick a certain behavior, a certain type of human behavior, and make that a very special category when we can already use that to address potentially issues that are coming up with sexuality? And now what I have noticed in the sex addiction community is that they have completely grabbed that now actual diagnosis and replaced it with their sex addiction types of narratives. So there's quite a bit of critique that became part of the ICD-11. I'm going to be very curious to see if it continues in the next decade or two. And I think what's really unfortunate is that all of these diagnoses, in a way, are based on distress, right? Distress. Who's distressed? And oftentimes with OCD, the person who's distressed is not only the person living with OCD, but their family and spouses, because there's a lot of checking and there's a lot of like anxiety around that, and it bleeds into a lot of the lived experiences. And the thing about obsessive compulsive behavior is that typically the behaviors that you're doing to, in essence, quell your obsessions are not necessarily pleasurable. You think of somebody washing their hands every 2 hours. It's compulsive. They're doing it because they can't quiet their mind and their anxiety without having done something to correct the anxiety narrative. But they're not like, oh, I love this. I love how my hands are becoming chapped and dry. And, it's a compulsion. And so a lot of times, we're acting like pleasurable sexual behavior that just happens to not fall under a certain religious standard applies to this diagnosis, which right off the bat doesn't really fit some of the criteria. So I'm very concerned about this, right? The pathologizing of sexuality throughout the history of the world is alive and well in 2025. Right. For example, nymphomania was a diagnosis for women with high drive, right? Now we have female arousal disorder for women with low drive, right? Which may be a disorder. It may be that you're not a high drive person. It may be that you're asexual, like you had brought up, Megan, right? And so, but we pathologize people because supposedly, according to our current cultural standards, you're not fitting what we all think or we've all decided is healthy sexuality.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up too, because Billy Crystal used to tell this joke where he would say, if I poop less often than my mom does, then I'm constipated. And if I poop more often than my mom does, then I have diarrhea. And if you kind of just replace your mom with society, it's like society has decided what's normal, even though that doesn't really exist. And if you don't fit within that thing that society decided, then you're not normal.
Yes.
So one thing my dad always said is like about recovering from recovery, and we'll let Randy say his thing, and then we'll talk about how do we recover from our sexual purity culture.
Well, it's not of any import, but my dad always said the best kind of woman to find is a virtuous nymphomaniac. That was his that was his advice to me.
That's good advice.
Where you can get your cake and eat it too.
Right.
In a way,
even if it has poop in it,
even if it has poop in it, that's right. Oh man. Yeah. So if we want to move into this idea of, well, what do we do about it? I do think that there are lots of different ways that this can be answered. So I've come up with a way to answer this question, which is based on a model. We as sex therapists are one of the basic models that we use is the Plicent model. And I'm not going to go into that because it doesn't really apply to all of you, but I took that model and then basically said, well, how do we apply this to the lay public? And so I've come up with what I call the pep talk model. And it's even a little thing I've copyrighted, right? So it's my stuff. But what that means is, so let's talk about what PEP stands for. And I kind of like the idea of giving yourself a pep talk, right? Because it's like, this can be really like sad when you start realizing like, wait, how was I socialized? And what was I made to believe about myself? And why can't I enjoy my sexuality? And why do I have so much residual shame and unnecessary guilt? It can really get people both angry, depressed, sad, betrayed, all the feelings that come along with kind of understanding how something impacted you later on. Because I do actually think purity culture is a form of psychological sexual abuse. I'm very clear about that. I'm very direct about that. We think about sexual abuse as physical, somebody raped me or molested me or touched me or did something that I was unwanted. But we cannot ignore that we are getting psychologically assaulted, and that those things really land, especially since so much of this assault is happening when we are at low developmental stages of our life and can't really make sense of things other than to blame ourselves, which is a very egocentric and developmentally appropriate thing for a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old to be thinking more ego self versus ego others. So the pep talk model starts with the first P is permission, right? Permission to really give yourself permission. I think most of us coming from Mormonism and high demand religions, we were not given permission. We were not given permission to identify ourselves or to own our own bodies or to even get certain types of education or to consider I could be queer or what is my gender identity or what gender roles really actually resonate with me versus how I was told men and women should or shouldn't act, right? And so permission to initiate, permission for time, permission for pleasure, right? Like permission to actually just enjoy something. I mean, Mormons are very much, put your shoulder to the wheel, as are American people. We don't have a good relationship with rest, leisure, and pleasure. It's more about productivity and what are you getting done and perfectionism, right? And so
sacrifice.
Yeah, giving yourself permission to go to therapy, giving yourself permission to have conversations with your partner or spouse, giving yourself permission to see yourself a different way than maybe you were told you were. So permission can go into so many beautiful areas, and so I really encourage that. The E after that stands for education. You have to educate yourself. We have been given so much misinformation about our anatomy, our psychology when it comes to sexuality, what we should or shouldn't, how we should or shouldn't show up. The idea of fantasy, we have so much misconceptions and miseducation around fantasy because, again, we grew up thinking that thoughts were almost just as bad as actions and lusting is not the good way to think about things. And so you have to educate, how does sexual fantasy show up in people's lives? And it's pretty normal, for example, for people to be attracted to more than one person. So this whole romantic script of you are the only one that I will ever have any, thoughts about. And if I have thoughts about anybody else, it's almost treated like infidelity, is just completely inaccurate as far as how human brains show up. So either you are asexual, which is about 1% to 3% of the population, and that's fine. It doesn't matter much to you. You don't have a lot of sexual thoughts, but it's not because you're some noble person who just magically has no thoughts other than the person that they're romantically inclined towards. It's just, that's your orientation. That's how you're wired. And then the rest of us will have other thoughts. And if we know those things and know how to communicate about them, and that has nothing really to do with how committed or loyal we are to people, just to have a thought about somebody else, then all of a sudden we can use fantasy for our benefit instead of this horrible, yucky thing we can't even talk about or consider. So education is hugely important.
Right.
And
plus, it's more than likely that the God of the world did not say, if you lust after someone in your heart, you've basically committed an adultery. It was probably a Greek fan of Jesus who put that into the scriptures that maybe had his own issues.
Yeah. And I don't really care who it came from. It's just incorrect. It's just not, it doesn't hold, it doesn't hold credibility. It's proven over and over again, even when you go in and do like science studies on people's, like they will not electroshock therapy, but they will measure your genital arousal. They'll measure your heart rate. They'll measure your pupils. They'll measure your nipple tautness, and they'll show you or read to you or expose you to some sexually erotic materials, and everyone responds to it. everyone, women, men, and then of course we have to think about that response consciously, and that's where we differ tremendously. But as far as physiological arousal, humans respond for the most part to sexual stimuli. So unless
That's right.
it's hormonally off balance, or maybe there's a wiring of less sexual interest, you're going to respond. And that's the education that we all need to be able to put these narratives into more healthy perspectives, instead of the narratives of somehow your loyalty and love towards me is measured by something that you don't even have a lot of control over, right? All right, so
that's to put so much harmful messaging into people's heads about relationships. And I know that as a younger person, before I really understood the concepts that you're talking about here, that I would feel personally threatened if my partner expressed attraction towards someone,
right.
Which, as you're saying, it's a completely normative thing to have happen. But specifically because of that scripture, when we think that through to its logical conclusion, we say, well, if you lust after someone, you've already done the deed, so you might as well be punished over it. And so I'm thinking, well, he's already cheated with me in his head, and that just causes so many relational problems that are just unnecessary.
And it's very
I think the term is hall pass. In marriages, everyone says, okay, if I had a hall pass, I would have sex with Heidi Klum,
And
a lot of
couples who are resilient to that and can have humor around that, that's actually a playful banter. But for some couples that are more in this kind of more orthodox purity kind of narrative, it's like that. You can't even joke about something like that. It's kind of like, what does that mean? Am I not enough for you? Why do you think that's funny? If you're thinking those thoughts, you're already having pretty much an affair. And the really unfortunate thing that has happened is that, especially going back to the porn addiction narrative, is that we have co-opted the language of betrayal trauma, which was originally meant for institutional betrayal. Like, for example, the Catholic Church moving pedophiles around instead of actually taking care of them. That's betrayal trauma, or us in the LDS Church that feel like we've been lied to and whitewashed about our own history. That's betrayal trauma. But then that's being co-opted for the feelings, which are very real. I'm not minimizing. I've been a woman who's been pissed off about pornography. It's very, very devastating feelings that, again, most of us were socialized to have because we were not given appropriate education. And so you have this discomfort. And so we call it betrayal trauma, which sets up this whole narrative, in the porn addiction movement, where typically, again, this is heterosexual couples. We don't see a lot of porn addiction issues coming up with gay men, lesbian women, that they've moved on from anything like that affecting their lives. But you see this kind of classic, I'm the virtuous woman who has to fight for her worth and her value through this incorrect idea that my spouse should only be interested in me, and that's how I get my worth and value, which actually is very anti-feminist, right? Which is, I really like to talk about this through the lens of a feminist lens, because I don't want it to feel like, oh, we're just elevating men and not caring about how they are, and we just need to be okay with male sexual behavior. No, this is about females being consistently put in that role of having to monitor male sexual behavior, and then on top of it, having hurt feelings about it that are artificially placed in our psyches. It's just like, it totally fucks us over, quite frankly. But then, this betrayal trauma is co-opted by that movement, which makes everybody feel like, oh yeah, the women are the virtuous, wonderful ones who have a right to be upset and sad. And the men are the perverse, horrible ones who need to get their sexuality under control. And that script, first of all, is incorrect. Second of all, it completely erodes their potential erotic connection.
Right. So we have permission, education, and the final P.
The final P is practice. And this is my favorite one, because this is where the rubber hits the road. You can give yourself permission to buy a violin. You can educate yourself through YouTube on how to play a violin. You can get all the information, but until you put that violin on your neck and get that rod and start making sounds that, quite frankly, sound fairly horrific at first, because you don't know what you're doing, even though you watched all the videos on how to do it. You have to put that muscle memory into the practice of doing something new and different, which is inherently uncomfortable, which is why so many people kind of avoid the practice of things. And this is at the heart of exposure therapy. This is, at the heart of so many different things. And I am really encouraging people. What also seems funny to me is that the church also says this. How does the church talk about this? Is they're like, don't do anything that could be bad, because you will get desensitized to those naughty things and you will no longer think they're naughty. And I'm like, can we please start desensitizing ourselves to some of these things so that then you can actually let the shame go? A good example is something as simple as masturbation. We come from a culture that really demonized and cinephized the touch of our own freaking bodies. We somehow got convinced that touching our own bodies was a big deal, which goes back to that ownership model. My body does not belong to me, which goes back to consent. How can I consent to anything when my body doesn't belong to me? So this is a huge first part of reclaiming sexuality in a lot of my sex therapy cases, is just learning how to give myself permission to own my own body, learning how to let my spouse have permission to own their own body, which goes back to this, oh no, what does that mean? And then practicing that. And I cannot tell you how many people, when they first start even trying to masturbate, will tell me stories like, as soon as it was over, I was crying. I had this wave of shame that came over me, even though intellectually I no longer agree that it's sin. I still have this visceral reaction that reminds me of shame, and it's a shame response because it's a learned response and it's a trauma response. And yes, I'm like, yep, we were expecting some of that, right? And the answer is not to not do it again. The answer is to do it again and again and again until you let go of that shame. And there's other examples. I'm sure people who maybe have either nuanced their faith in LDS land or maybe have left their faith have done a few of these things, right? Like drinking coffee, right? Maybe the first time you drank coffee, you were like, oh my gosh, I feel so weird about this. Then it was walking around with the coffee cup where other people could see me. That's also very uncomfortable. It's interesting now with the new garment lines, right, for women's clothing. Yeah, you've got your coffee, Randy. Like even when it's approved, right, that the church is now shifting the garment line, I'm talking to lots of women that are still uncomfortable showing their shoulders because they've been so trained to not show their shoulders that even now that they have official permission from the church to do so, that does not shift overnight. So I would say a lot of times our intellects do shift, and they can shift quickly. How many people have read the CES letter or something and said, within a weekend, I was deconverted? But the visceral body and the emotions take much longer to deconstruct whatever it is that we're doing. So
that's right. And practice includes experimentation, right?
Experimentation, right. And it doesn't mean
what you like.
It doesn't mean everything that we practice we will like, like sometimes I help people practice things like oral sex or anal sex or, figuring out new ways to orgasm or using a sex toy. They may or may not decide that those are things that they really want to keep in their sexual repertoire, but at least they're giving themselves permission to, like you're saying, explore, practice, and see if these things become easier or more interesting as I give myself permission to practice them. And then the talk part is, the talk is, we know that we are group animals and talking is very helpful, which is why therapy is very helpful. Professional coaching by people who are actually trained somewhat is very helpful. Talking with peers or with other people who are going through similar situations. That's why group therapy is so powerful, right? So the talk piece is a huge part of how human beings process. And so that's my little answer for shame recovery is give yourself a pep talk.
There you go. And practice is a lot different than fake it until you make it.
Oh,
You're you're not preaching a dogma and saying, everybody, you need to start practicing anal sex until you like it.
No.
It's good for some people and it's not good for other people. It's
Right.
just experiment.
Exactly.
And faking it till you're making it is a dogmatic approach to something, right?
Yeah.
Do
I mean,
this.
there's some science to back up the fake until you make it approach. Like, for example, if you're not having a great day and you kind of, like force yourself to smile, you can actually start feeling a little bit better. So, I mean, it's not that that's completely bad, but when it comes to the sexual realm, this is really where you have to really prioritize consent, and consent even with yourself. Like sometimes we're like, well, I should want to have sex with my partner, right? Or I should like oral sex, or my peers are saying I should like pornography and it should be no big deal. But then it sits differently in your body and you're really kind of selling yourself short. So giving yourself consent first is such a thing that we need to practice, especially when we come from communities where really we were taught to pleasure, to people please, and to accommodate others much more than ourselves. And we were taught to sacrifice ourselves for the benefit of whoever, God, the community. And so we are not well boundaried with our own bodies, right? It's hard for us to say no. It's hard for us to feel like I'm going to disappoint somebody else. So this is a huge part of the differentiation model that I work, especially with couples, is you can tolerate disappointing your partner. And if your partner is disappointed, that is okay too. They're not a golden retriever. It doesn't mean that if you say, no, I don't want to have sex with you, your partner should be like, no problem. That's great. They can be like, oh, okay, but you also can't be pouting for 3 days and giving the person silent treatment. So it's like, how do you cyclically give each other the right to disappoint each other? Because that's part of negotiation.
And I will say too, all of the rhetoric and narrative that you're talking about right now is one of the things that made me so vulnerable to be sexually abused, because the things that I was being programmed as a 7-year-old by the predator are the same things that my parents was telling me, by the way. It's not okay to say no. You trust adults. You do whatever the adults say. You don't have permission to do anything or say anything that's contrary to what the adults do. So we do our children such a disservice by not teaching them how to boundary themselves appropriately. And I was guilty of it as a young mom too.
That's right. So thank you so much, Natasha, for coming on our show. We'll also provide a link to your practice. You send me the links and we'll put them down there in the description. Megan or Randy, do you have any final thoughts?
I just want to say thank you to Natasha for coming and teaching us about this. I think it's such a valuable conversation and so many people are going to learn really critical information. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think that it's such a blessing for those hearing this to be able to hopefully release a lot of guilt that they've been holding for so long. Your words are so sage, and we so appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you.
That's right. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jean.
I was just going to say Natasha has said a lot of words that made me think about other shows we can do in the future.
Well, I'm always happy to come back. As you can tell, once you get me rolling and talking about sexuality, I can go all over the place. And I love the education piece. I feel like all of this stuff that like almost nothing other than the pep talk approach were originally my ideas, right? What I felt like I did is I went out into the field of sexual health and mental health and gathered so much information that was so powerful to my own healing journey, which took really, I'm still in it, but was definitely a 20+ healing journey from all of this stuff. To the point that now I can many times enjoy sexuality, my own sexuality, in much less inhibited ways, which impacts my quality of orgasm, my quality of connection, my quality of pleasure. It's really a whole new world. And so I love bringing that information back to my community. Now, granted, I was punished harshly for doing that or trying to do that, but this is not Natasha Helfer's ideas. Maybe I'm good at expressing thoughts or bringing it, I think I'm an okay educator, but I just want to really point that out, that everything I've talked about can be backed up with science.
That's right. Well, thanks everybody for watching. You've experienced a pep talk from Natasha Helfer. And thanks so much. Like, share, and subscribe, and have a great rest of 2025. Bye-bye.
Love you. Mean it.